Before the fall of Rome, before the rise of Greece, before the first great empires of the classical world, there was another age of power, wealth, and astonishing international connection. Around the year 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was home to some of the most advanced civilizations humanity had ever seen. Vast kingdoms ruled from monumental cities. Merchant fleets crossed the seas carrying copper, tin, gold, ivory, and luxury goods. Kings wrote letters to one another across thousands of kilometers, addressing each other as equals in a sophisticated diplomatic network. It was a world of palaces, armies, and global trade. And then, within a single generation, it collapsed. Entire cities burned to the ground. Kingdoms vanished from history. Trade routes that had connected continents for centuries suddenly disappeared. Writing systems were forgotten. Populations scattered. For hundreds of years afterward, the Mediterranean world would enter what historians now call a dark age. The strangest part is that this catastrophe did not strike one kingdom alone. It struck all of them. The Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece collapsed. The mighty Hittite Empire vanished. Great cities across the Levant burned. Even Egypt, the most powerful civilization of the age, nearly fell. All of this happened around a single moment in history, 1177 BC. For more than a century, historians have tried to answer one haunting question. What happened in that year? What force could have shattered the entire Bronze Age world at once? Was it invasion, climate disaster, earthquakes, economic collapse, or something even more complicated? To understand the mystery of 1177 BC, we must first travel back to the world that existed before the collapse. A world far more connected, prosperous, and fragile than most people imagine. By the late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean had become something remarkable in human history. A vast international system of powerful states connected through trade, diplomacy, and shared economic networks. Across the region stood a collection of great civilizations. In mainland Greece, the Mycenaean kingdoms ruled from fortified palace cities like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. These were not primitive settlements. They were organized, bureaucratic states with writing systems, centralized economies, and powerful warrior elites. To the east rose the Hittite Empire, one of the great superpowers of the ancient world. From their capital at Hattusa in Anatolia, the Hittites controlled vast territories stretching across modern Turkey and northern Syria. Their kings commanded large armies, negotiated complex treaties, and rivaled Egypt for dominance of the Near East. Further south along the Nile stood Egypt, the most enduring civilization of the Bronze Age. Under rulers like Ramses II and later Ramses III, Egypt possessed enormous wealth, monumental architecture, and an army capable of projecting power far beyond its borders. Between these great powers lay the cities of the Levant, Ugarit, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and countless others. These coastal city-states served as vital trading hubs linking the Mediterranean world to Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Egypt. But what truly defined this era was not simply the existence of powerful kingdoms. It was how deeply connected they had become. What made the late Bronze Age world truly extraordinary was not simply the existence of powerful kingdoms. It was the web of connections that tied them together. For the first time in history, multiple civilizations across thousands of kilometers were bound into a single economic system. Ships crossed the Mediterranean constantly, carrying cargo that moved between distant lands. Copper from Cyprus traveled to workshops in Greece and Anatolia. Tin from regions as distant as Central Asia was transported through complex trade routes before finally arriving at Bronze Age foundries. Together, copper and tin created bronze, the metal that defined the entire era. Weapons, tools, armor, and ceremonial objects were all made from it. Without these two metals, the military power and economic stability of the age would collapse. and that meant every kingdom depended on trade. Luxury goods traveled alongside these vital materials: ivory from Africa, gold from Egypt, precious stones from distant lands, and fine textiles moved between royal courts. Elite families displayed these goods as symbols of prestige and influence. But trade was only part of the story. Diplomacy also connected the great powers of the Bronze Age world. Kings wrote letters to each other across enormous distances, addressing one another as brother. These messages, preserved in clay tablets discovered by archaeologists, reveal a surprisingly personal and sophisticated international system. Rulers negotiated marriages between royal families, exchanged gifts of incredible value, and coordinated military alliances. A king in Babylon might request gold from Egypt. A ruler in Anatolia might send a princess to marry a foreign monarch. Diplomatic envoys traveled across deserts, mountains, and seas, carrying messages that helped maintain the delicate balance of power. For centuries, this system worked. The great kingdoms prospered. Cities grew larger, trade expanded, wealth flowed across the Mediterranean. To the people living within it, the late Bronze Age must have seemed like a stable and enduring world. But beneath the surface, this international system contained a hidden weakness. Because the more interconnected civilizations became, the more dependent they were on one another. If one part of the system failed, the consequences could ripple outward across the entire network. A disruption to trade could weaken armies. A famine in one region could destabilize another. The fall of a single kingdom could trigger chaos across the Mediterranean. In modern terms, the Bronze Age world had become something very familiar. It had become globalized. And like all highly interconnected systems, it was powerful, but fragile. For centuries, the balance held. Then, sometime around the early 12th century BC, the system began to break. At first, the signs were small. A destroyed city here, a disrupted trade route there. But soon, the disturbances began to spread. Within a few decades, flames would consume entire kingdoms. And by the year 1177 BC, the ancient world stood on the edge of collapse. For centuries, the Bronze Age world appeared stable and prosperous. Across the eastern Mediterranean, powerful kingdoms ruled from fortified capitals and monumental palaces. Merchant ships moved constantly between ports carrying copper, tin, grain, textiles, ivory, and luxury goods. Diplomats traveled across deserts and seas with messages written on clay tablets. Kings addressed one another as equals, calling each other brother in letters that crossed thousands of kilometers. It was one of the most interconnected worlds humanity had ever created. The system worked because every part of it depended on the others. Copper from Cyprus traveled to workshops in Greece and Anatolia. Tin from distant regions moved through long and complicated trade routes before arriving at Bronze Age foundries. Together, these metals created bronze, the essential material for weapons, armor, tools, and agricultural equipment. Without these trade networks, the entire system would struggle to function. But sometime in the late 13th century BC, subtle signs of instability began to appear. At first, the disturbances seemed small. A shipment that arrived late, a coastal village attacked by raiders, a harvest that produced less grain than expected, a palace damaged by fire or earthquake. Individually, none of these events would have seemed unusual. Ancient societies were accustomed to hardship. Crops sometimes failed. Wars erupted between rival kingdoms. Earthquakes could destroy cities without warning. For generations, civilizations had survived these kinds of disasters. But this time something was different. The disruptions did not remain isolated. Instead, they began appearing across multiple regions of the Mediterranean at roughly the same time. Archaeologists studying the final decades of the Bronze Age have uncovered a growing pattern of destruction. Excavations across Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant reveal burned buildings, collapsed walls, abandoned settlements, and shattered palaces. At first glance, these events might seem unrelated. A war in one region, a fire in another. perhaps an earthquake somewhere else. But when historians place these events together, a far more troubling picture begins to emerge. The system that connected the Bronze Age world was starting to unravel. In Mycenaean Greece, palace centers that had dominated regional economies began to suffer catastrophic fires. These palaces were not simply royal residences. They were administrative headquarters where scribes recorded agricultural production, tracked livestock, stored bronze weapons, and managed trade across entire territories. When a palace burned, the consequences were enormous. Without the palace administration, taxes could not be collected, armies could not be equipped, trade could not be organized. The economic system that supported the kingdom quickly began to collapse. Evidence from the palace of Pylos reveals how sudden this destruction may have been. Clay tablets found in the ruins contain records of weapons, chariots, and defensive preparations. Scribes were documenting supplies and military resources almost until the moment the palace itself was destroyed. Whatever threat they were preparing for arrived too quickly. The palace burned, and the kingdom that depended on it soon followed. Similar destruction appeared elsewhere across the Mediterranean. Cities along the Levantine coast, vital hubs of international trade, also began to suffer violent ends. Excavations at sites such as Hazor and Ashkelon reveal massive fires that reduced entire neighborhoods to ruins. In some cases, the destruction was so severe that the cities were never rebuilt. Yet perhaps the most chilling warning came from a city that once stood at the center of the Bronze Age trading world, a port city called Ugarit. Located on the Syrian coast, Ugarit was one of the wealthiest commercial centers of the late Bronze Age. Merchant ships arrived from Cyprus, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Aegean. Warehouses overflowed with goods from distant lands. Royal archives stored thousands of clay tablets recording trade agreements, diplomatic messages, and administrative records. Ugarit was deeply connected to the international network that defined the Bronze Age world. And then, suddenly, the city vanished. Archaeologists later discovered Ugarit buried beneath a thick destruction layer dating to the early 12th century BC. But among the ruins, they also uncovered something extraordinary. Letters written in the final days before the city's fall. These messages reveal a growing sense of fear. Enemy ships had appeared along the coast. The king sent urgent requests for help, but the help never arrived. By the time the messages were written, the system that had once protected cities like Ugarit was already beginning to collapse, and the crisis was only just beginning. Among the ruins of Ugarit, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. Hidden inside the remains of the royal palace were clay tablets that had never been delivered. These tablets preserved letters written in the final days before the city was destroyed. They offer a rare glimpse into the moment when the Bronze Age world began to collapse. One letter describes enemy ships appearing along the coast. The tone is urgent and fearful. The king of Ugarit writes to a neighboring ruler asking for immediate assistance. His message suggests that the city is under threat and desperately needs military support. But the response never arrived. Another letter reveals that Ugarit's own army had already been sent elsewhere. The kingdom's forces were apparently committed to campaigns far from home, leaving the city dangerously exposed at the very moment when new enemies began to appear. This detail reveals something important about the crisis unfolding across the Mediterranean. Many of the great powers were already stretched thin. Armies were deployed in distant territories. Trade routes were unstable. Alliances were under pressure. When danger suddenly appeared, the system that normally provided protection could not respond quickly enough. The king of Ugarit was not simply facing an attack. He was facing it alone. Within a short time, the city was destroyed so completely that it was never rebuilt. The harbor fell silent. The warehouses collapsed. The archives were buried beneath rubble and ash. For centuries afterward, the city remained forgotten. But Ugarit was only one of many places experiencing similar disasters. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the final decades of the Bronze Age are marked by a wave of destruction that appears almost simultaneous. Archaeological evidence shows cities burning in Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond. Entire palace centers vanished. Trade routes collapsed. Populations declined. For historians trying to understand this period, one question stands above all others. What could cause so many civilizations to fall at roughly the same moment? Ancient Egyptian records provide one possible answer. Carved into the walls of temples built by Pharaoh Ramses III are inscriptions describing a terrifying enemy. According to these texts, powerful groups of invaders had appeared across the Mediterranean, attacking coastal cities and overwhelming entire kingdoms. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. These mysterious groups arrived not as small bands of pirates, but as massive migrating forces. Egyptian reliefs show fleets of ships filled with warriors, families, and wagons loaded with possessions. They were not simply raiders. They looked more like entire populations on the move. Where they came from remains uncertain. Some scholars believe they originated in the Aegean world. Others argue that they came from Anatolia or regions further west. It is possible that several different groups joined together during a time of widespread crisis, moving across the Mediterranean in search of new lands. Whatever their origin, the Sea Peoples were devastatingly effective. Cities across the Levant burned as they advanced southward along the coast. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries suddenly vanished. Trade networks that once connected the Mediterranean world collapsed as ports were destroyed and sea routes became dangerous. Even the great empires struggled to resist them. The Hittite Empire, one of the most powerful states of the Bronze Age, would soon disappear from history entirely. Egypt itself barely survived. Inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III describe massive battles fought to stop the Sea Peoples from invading the Nile Delta. Egyptian armies managed to defeat them after fierce fighting on both land and sea, but even victory came at a cost. Egypt's resources were stretched thin. The international system that had once supported trade and diplomacy was already breaking apart, and while the Sea Peoples may have delivered some of the final blows, they were not the only force contributing to the collapse. Something much larger was happening. A chain reaction of disasters was beginning to spread across the ancient world. The combination of war, migration, economic breakdown, and environmental stress. The Bronze Age system that had connected civilizations for centuries was reaching its breaking point, and the worst was still to come. Long before the rise of classical Greece, another civilization ruled the Greek mainland. Historians call it Mycenaean Greece. During the late Bronze Age, powerful warrior kings governed from massive fortified citadels built on strategic hills across the mainland. Cities such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes controlled surrounding territories through complex palace administrations, regional storage systems, and heavily armed elites whose power rested on bronze, land, and organized force. These were not primitive societies waiting for civilization to begin. The Mycenaeans possessed bureaucratic governments, skilled metal workers, extensive trade links, impressive architecture, and fleets of ships that connected them to the wider Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. Their palaces stored huge quantities of grain, olive oil, wine, wool, and bronze weapons. Scribes used a script known as Linear B to record taxes, labor, livestock, trade goods, and military supplies with astonishing precision. For centuries, this system functioned. The Mycenaean kingdoms grew rich through trade, warfare, and control over agricultural production. Luxury goods flowed into elite centers. Imported materials arrived from abroad. Bronze weapons equipped warriors who projected royal authority over the countryside. To later generations, these kings would become half-legendary figures, remembered in Greek tradition as the rulers of a heroic age. But by the early 12th century BC, that world began to fail. Across mainland Greece, many of the great palace centers show evidence of destruction. Archaeologists have uncovered burned buildings, shattered walls, abandoned storage areas, and signs of abrupt collapse at multiple sites. At Mycenae, important structures were damaged and rebuilt under increasingly strained conditions. At Tiryns, sections of the citadel suffered destruction and later decline. At Pylos, the palace complex was destroyed by a catastrophic fire and never regained its former function. The destruction at Pylos is especially revealing. Among the ruins, archaeologists found hundreds of clay tablets that had been accidentally preserved in the blaze. Normally, these tablets were not meant to last. They were temporary records, written on damp clay and stored for administrative use. But when the palace burned, the intense heat baked them hard, preserving a snapshot of the kingdom's final days. What those tablets reveal is unsettling. They show a palace administration under pressure. Officials were tracking weapons. Men were being assigned to guard coastal regions. Resources were being organized. Defensive preparations appear to have been underway. The scribes were still working, still recording, still trying to impose order on a world that was becoming more dangerous by the day. That detail matters, because it suggests the rulers of Pylos knew some kind of threat was approaching. But whatever danger they feared, they could not stop it. The palace burned, and with it, the central system that held the kingdom together. Without the palace bureaucracy, there was no institution left to coordinate taxation, organize labor, distribute goods, control trade, or equip armed forces on the same scale. The destruction of one palace was not merely the loss of a royal home, it was the collapse of an entire administrative engine. And this pattern repeated itself. One by one, the Mycenaean palace centers weakened, burned, or were abandoned. Some may have been attacked from outside, others may have fallen to internal rebellion, famine, or political breakdown. In some places, earthquakes may have played a role. In others, fire and violence seem unmistakable. What makes the pattern so haunting is that no single explanation fits every site perfectly. Yet the overall result is clear. The palace world of Mycenaean Greece collapsed. The consequences were enormous. Long-distance trade shrank dramatically. Monumental construction declined. Population levels appear to have fallen in several regions. Elite craftsmanship became rarer, and perhaps most striking of all, writing disappeared. The linear B script, once used to manage palace economies, vanished from Greece for centuries. This was not just political decline. It was civilizational contraction. What followed is often called the Greek Dark Age, a period lasting roughly 400 years during which the Greek world became poorer, less centralized, and far less connected to the great international networks of the Eastern Mediterranean. The memory of the old palace kingdoms survived only in fragments, stories of mighty kings, walled citadels, heroic warriors, and a lost age of power. But the collapse of Mycenaean Greece did not happen in isolation. That is what makes it so important. The destruction of these palace centers occurred during the same broad period when cities in the Levant were burning, when Ugarit was sending desperate letters for help, and when powerful migrating forces were striking coasts across the Mediterranean. In other words, the fall of the Mycenaean world was not simply a Greek disaster. It was one part of a much larger breakdown spreading through the entire Bronze Age system. And if even the fortified kingdoms of Greece could fall so quickly, then no civilization in the region was truly safe, not even the great empires. Because while Mycenaean Greece was descending into ruin, an even greater power to the east was approaching its own end, a superpower that had once rivaled Egypt itself, the Hittite Empire. While the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece were beginning to collapse, an even more powerful state was facing its own catastrophe. To the east of the Aegean world stood one of the great superpowers of the Bronze Age, the Hittite Empire. At its height, the Hittite kingdom controlled vast territories across Anatolia and northern Syria. Its rulers commanded large armies, negotiated complex diplomatic treaties, and competed directly with Egypt for influence across the Near East. The empire's capital, Hattusa, was one of the largest and most impressive cities of the ancient world. Massive stone walls surrounded the city. Monumental gates guarded its entrances. Royal palaces and temples stood within a sprawling urban center that served as the administrative heart of the empire. For centuries, Hittite kings had managed a complex network of alliances and rival states. Some territories were governed directly by the empire. Others were ruled by vassal kings who owed loyalty and military support to the Hittite throne. It was a system designed to maintain stability across a vast and diverse landscape. But by the late 13th century BC, the empire was under increasing strain. Texts from the final generations of Hittite rule suggest growing instability. Some regions experienced food shortages. Others faced unrest among subject populations. Trade routes that had once supplied essential materials became less reliable. At the same time, pressure from external enemies began to increase. To the west, rival groups threatened Hittite territories in Anatolia. To the south, political tensions rose along the borders with Levantine states. Meanwhile, the broader Bronze Age system that supported international trade and diplomacy was beginning to fracture. In such conditions, even powerful empires can become vulnerable. Then, sometime in the early 12th century BC, the Hittite world collapsed. The capital city of Hattusa was abandoned and destroyed. Archaeological evidence suggests that large portions of the city burned before it was deserted. The royal administration disappeared. Government records stopped. The vast imperial structure that had once controlled huge territories simply vanished. Even more striking is what followed. Unlike many ancient capitals, Hattusa was never rebuilt as a major political center. The empire did not recover. The Hittite state, once one of the most formidable powers of the Bronze Age, disappeared entirely from history. For centuries afterward, the memory of the Hittites faded so completely that later civilizations barely remembered they had existed. Only in the 19th century did archaeologists rediscover the ruins of Hattusa and begin to reconstruct the story of this lost empire. But the mystery remains. How could such a powerful state collapse so suddenly? The answer is likely complex. Some historians believe invading groups played a role in the destruction. Others point to internal rebellions among subject populations. Still others suggest environmental problems such as drought may have weakened the empire's ability to feed its population and maintain stability. In reality, all of these pressures may have been acting at once. The Hittite Empire, like the Mycenaean kingdoms and the cities of the Levant, depended on the broader international system of the late Bronze Age. When trade networks weakened, resources became scarce. When distant allies struggled with their own crises, support disappeared. When multiple threats emerged simultaneously, even a great empire could lose its balance. What makes the fall of the Hittites especially significant is its timing. The disappearance of this empire occurred during the same general period when Mycenaean palaces were burning, when cities like Ugarit were being destroyed, and when migrating forces were moving across the Mediterranean. This was not a series of isolated collapses. It was a chain reaction. Each failing kingdom weakened the system further. Each destroyed city disrupted trade routes and alliances that others depended on. As more pieces of the network fell away, the remaining civilizations found themselves increasingly exposed. The Bronze Age world had once been a system of powerful states linked together through diplomacy, commerce, and shared dependence on trade. Now that system was unraveling. And as the 12th century BC continued, the crisis would reach its most dramatic moment. Because even the greatest civilization of the ancient world would soon face the storm. Egypt itself. As the Bronze Age world moved closer to collapse, ancient records begin describing the appearance of a mysterious and deeply feared force moving across the Mediterranean Sea. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. Unlike many other events from this chaotic period, these groups appeared directly in historical inscriptions carved into temple walls. Some of the most detailed accounts come from monuments built during the reign of the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III, who ruled in the early 12th century BC. These inscriptions describe a time when entire regions of the eastern Mediterranean were collapsing under the pressure of violent invasions and mass migrations. What makes these accounts especially striking is the scale of the threat. The Sea Peoples were not described as small bands of pirates or isolated raiders attacking individual towns. Egyptian reliefs instead show fleets of ships filled with warriors moving across the sea in large numbers. The carvings depict fighters carrying long swords, round shields, and wearing distinctive helmets decorated with horns or feathers. In several scenes, the ships also appear to carry women, children, animals, and wagons loaded with possessions. This detail has fascinated historians for generations. It suggests that the Sea Peoples were not simply raiding coastal cities. They were migrating. Entire communities appear to have been moving across the Mediterranean, searching for new lands during a time when the old political order was breaking apart. Exactly where these groups came from remains one of the greatest mysteries of ancient history. Some scholars believe they originated in the Aegean region, possibly connected to the collapse of the Mycenaean kingdoms in Greece. Others suggest they may have come from western Anatolia, where the weakening of the Hittite Empire could have forced populations to migrate. There is also a growing theory that the Sea Peoples were not a single ethnic group at all. Instead, they may have been a coalition of different peoples brought together by the same growing crisis. As the Bronze Age system began to collapse, food shortages, political instability, and broken trade networks may have displaced entire populations. Refugees, warriors, and migrating communities could have joined forces as they moved across the Mediterranean in search of safer territory. For societies that depended heavily on maritime trade, the appearance of such migrating forces was extremely dangerous. The economies of the late Bronze Age relied on constant shipments of copper and tin to produce bronze weapons, tools, and agricultural equipment. Copper came largely from Cyprus, while tin traveled through long and fragile trade routes stretching across Anatolia and the Near East. Without these metals, the production of bronze would slow dramatically. And without bronze, armies could not maintain their weapons, farmers could not repair their tools, and craftsmen could not produce the goods that supported the palace economies. Trade was the lifeblood of the Bronze Age world. If the sea became unsafe, the entire system would begin to weaken. This is exactly what appears to have happened during the final decades of the 13th century BC. Archaeological evidence across the Mediterranean shows widespread destruction during this period. Cities along the Levantine coast were burned or abandoned. Important trading ports suddenly disappeared from the historical record. Some of these cities were rebuilt. Others were never occupied again. The pattern of destruction suggests a world that was losing control of its own stability. But the Sea Peoples were not attacking a strong and unified civilization. They were entering a system that had already begun to fracture. The Mycenaean palace centers of Greece were collapsing. The Hittite Empire was weakening and would soon disappear entirely. Cities such as Ugarit had already been destroyed. Trade routes were becoming unreliable, and diplomatic alliances between kingdoms were starting to fail. In other words, the Sea Peoples were striking a world that was already dangerously unstable. And when enough pressure is applied to a fragile system, collapse can spread quickly. As these migrating groups moved southward along the Mediterranean coast, they left behind a trail of destruction that frightened even the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. Entire regions were thrown into chaos. Cities burned, trade stopped, populations fled. The Bronze Age world had once functioned like a vast network linking powerful kingdoms together through commerce, diplomacy, and military alliances. Now that network was beginning to break apart, and as the Sea Peoples continued their migration, their path would soon lead them to the greatest kingdom that still remained standing: Egypt. But Egypt was not the easy target they expected, because when the Sea Peoples finally reached the borders of the Nile Delta, they would face one of the most dramatic battles recorded in ancient history. A battle that would determine whether the last great civilization of the Bronze Age would survive the storm or collapse like all the others. By the early 12th century BC, the Mediterranean world had already begun to collapse. Across Greece, Mycenaean palace centers were burning. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire was disappearing from history. Along the Levantine coast, cities that had once been wealthy trading hubs were being destroyed or abandoned. The international system that had connected these civilizations for centuries was beginning to break apart. Amid this growing chaos, the migrating forces known as the Sea Peoples continued moving southward along the Mediterranean coast. Eventually, their path led them to the borders of Egypt. For generations, Egypt had been one of the strongest and most stable civilizations in the ancient world. Protected by vast deserts and sustained by the fertile Nile River, the kingdom had survived wars and political crises that destroyed many other societies. But the threat now approaching its borders was unlike anything Egypt had faced before. According to Egyptian inscriptions, the Sea Peoples had already devastated several powerful regions before turning toward the Nile Delta. Entire kingdoms had fallen as these migrating groups advanced across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities burned, trade routes collapsed, populations fled. When Pharaoh Ramesses III learned that these forces were moving toward Egypt, he understood that the survival of his kingdom might depend on the coming battle. Unlike many rulers whose states had already collapsed, Ramesses still commanded a powerful and organized government. Egypt maintained large armies, experienced officers, and a strong administrative system capable of mobilizing resources quickly. The pharaoh ordered defensive preparations across the Nile Delta. Soldiers were stationed along strategic positions. Fortifications were strengthened near the coastal approaches. Egyptian naval forces were prepared to confront the invading fleets before they could move inland through the river channels. Ramses did not intend to fight a defensive war inside Egypt. Instead, he planned to trap the invaders. The geography of the Nile Delta gave him an advantage. The region was filled with narrow waterways and branching river channels. Large fleets unfamiliar with these waters could easily become trapped if they advanced too far inland. Ramses planned to use this environment against the invaders. When the Sea Peoples finally approached Egypt, the pharaoh's forces were ready. The dramatic battle that followed was recorded in extraordinary detail on the walls of the temple at Medinet Habu, one of the best-preserved monuments of ancient Egypt. The carved reliefs show Egyptian ships lined along the waterways while enemy vessels approach from the open sea. Archers stand on the decks of Egyptian ships and along the riverbanks. Arrows fill the air. The carvings depict chaotic fighting as ships collide and warriors struggle in the water. Some enemy vessels appear overturned while others are trapped in narrow channels with no room to maneuver. This was exactly the situation Ramses had intended to create. Once the invading fleet entered the confined waterways of the Delta, Egyptian forces attacked from multiple directions. Archers rained arrows down from both land and ships while Egyptian vessels blocked escape routes. Many of the enemy ships were destroyed, others were captured. Egyptian inscriptions claim that the Sea Peoples were defeated and that large numbers of prisoners were taken after the battle. Whether these accounts are somewhat exaggerated, as royal propaganda often was, the outcome is clear. Egypt survived. But victory in battle did not mean the crisis was over. Even though Ramses had stopped the invasion, the world around Egypt had already changed forever. Many of the kingdoms that once formed the Bronze Age international system were gone. The Hittite Empire had vanished. The Mycenaean palace world had collapsed. Important trading cities across the Levant had been destroyed. The network that had connected these civilizations through trade and diplomacy had shattered. Egypt had survived the storm, but the age that had supported it for centuries was coming to an end. Without the old trade networks, Egypt's economy began to weaken. Foreign diplomacy declined. The great powers that once balanced the political order of the Mediterranean were no longer there. The Bronze Age world had depended on a delicate web of connections between distant civilizations. Once those connections broke, The consequences spread everywhere. The collapse was not caused by a single invasion or a single disaster. It was the failure of an entire system. And in the years that followed, the Mediterranean world would descend into one of the most mysterious periods of ancient history. A dark age that would last for centuries. By the time the Sea Peoples reached the borders of Egypt, the Bronze Age world had already begun to collapse. Cities across Greece were burning. The Hittite Empire had vanished from history. Important trading ports along the Levantine coast had been destroyed or abandoned. Trade routes that had once connected powerful civilizations across thousands of kilometers were becoming increasingly dangerous. To the people living during that time, these disasters may have seemed unrelated. One kingdom might blame invading enemies. Another might believe famine had weakened its population. Some rulers likely believed the gods themselves had turned against them. But when historians examine the evidence today, a different pattern becomes visible. They see the collapse of an entire system. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean was not simply a collection of independent kingdoms. It was an interconnected network of civilizations tied together through trade, diplomacy, and shared dependence on critical resources. Copper, mined in Cyprus, traveled across the Mediterranean to workshops in Greece, Anatolia, and the Near East. Tin, a rarer and more difficult metal to obtain, moved through long and fragile trade routes that connected distant regions. When copper and tin were combined, they created bronze. And bronze was the foundation of the entire Bronze Age world. Weapons were made from it. Tools were forged from it. Agricultural equipment depended on it. Armies relied on bronze swords and spearheads to maintain military strength. Without bronze, the political and economic systems of these civilizations could not function. This meant that nearly every major kingdom in the Mediterranean depended on trade networks that stretched across vast distances. If those networks failed, the consequences would spread quickly. And sometime around the late 13th century BC, those networks began to weaken. Ships stopped arriving in ports that had once been busy with merchants and cargo. Trade routes that had connected distant lands became unpredictable. Supplies of critical materials began to shrink. At first, the disruptions may have seemed temporary. A shipment delayed by storms, a caravan lost to bandits, a harbor closed because of local conflict. But as the disruptions continued, the effects began to multiply. Without steady deliveries of copper and tin, the production of bronze weapons slowed. Armies struggled to maintain their equipment. Palace administrations that depended on trade income began to lose resources. Once that process began, it became difficult to stop. The Bronze Age system had grown extremely complex over the centuries. Kingdoms specialized in certain resources and relied on their neighbors for others. Diplomacy connected royal courts across the Mediterranean. Merchants moved goods between distant regions with remarkable efficiency. But this interconnection created a dangerous weakness. The more civilizations depended on each other, the more vulnerable the entire system became. If one major kingdom collapsed, its allies would lose a critical partner in trade and defense. If a key trade route became unsafe, several regions could suddenly lose access to essential materials. If famine struck one area, migrations and conflict could spread outward into neighboring territories. This is what historians call systemic collapse. Instead of a single disaster destroying a single civilization, multiple pressures begin affecting an interconnected network at the same time. Each failure weakens the system further. Each crisis spreads instability to other regions. Eventually, the entire structure begins to unravel. That is exactly what appears to have happened during the final decades of the Bronze Age. The Mediterranean world had spent centuries building a vast network of economic and political connections. But once that network began to break, the collapse spread faster than anyone could control. The fall of one kingdom weakened another. The destruction of one port disrupted trade across entire regions. Every new disaster made the system more fragile. And by the time the 12th century BC began, the ancient world was facing a crisis unlike anything it had experienced before. The Bronze Age system was not collapsing because of a single enemy. It was collapsing because the entire structure had become too fragile to survive the pressures now surrounding it. And those pressures were about to become even worse. Because alongside invasion and economic breakdown, another threat was spreading across the Mediterranean world. A slow but devastating environmental crisis, one that could destroy harvests, weaken populations, and push entire civilizations toward the edge of collapse. A drought that may have lasted for decades. While invasions and political instability were spreading across the Mediterranean, another crisis was unfolding more quietly. It did not arrive with armies or burning cities. It arrived slowly, year after year, harvest after harvest. Evidence gathered by modern scientists suggests that the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged period of severe drought around the time the Bronze Age world began to collapse. This environmental shift may have lasted for decades. At first, the effects would have seemed subtle. A harvest slightly smaller than expected, rivers running lower than usual, pastures drying earlier in the season. For agricultural societies that depended heavily on predictable weather patterns, even small changes could create enormous stress. The civilizations of the Bronze Age relied on stable harvests to support large populations, palace administrations, armies, and trade networks. If crops failed repeatedly, the consequences would spread quickly through society. Food shortages would appear first, then prices would rise. Farmers might abandon fields that could no longer produce reliable harvests. Cities that depended on agricultural taxes would struggle to maintain their bureaucracies and military forces. In extreme cases, famine could follow. There is growing archaeological evidence suggesting that drought conditions affected large parts of the Eastern Mediterranean during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. Scientists studying ancient pollen samples taken from lake sediments have found signs that vegetation in several regions changed dramatically during this period. Plants that thrive in wetter climates declined, while species adapted to drier conditions became more common. This suggests that rainfall across the region may have dropped significantly. Tree ring data from certain areas also supports this theory. Narrow growth rings in ancient wood samples indicate years of environmental stress, possibly linked to prolonged dry conditions. If the Mediterranean climate did shift in this way, the consequences for Bronze Age civilizations would have been severe. Agriculture would suffer, grain production would fall. Livestock populations might shrink as grazing lands deteriorated. And once food supplies began to decline, political stability could collapse quickly. History shows that famine often leads to migration. When people can no longer feed their families, they move. Entire communities might abandon their homes in search of better land, water, or safety. These migrations could bring new populations into already unstable regions, increasing tensions between different groups. Some historians believe this environmental stress may have helped trigger the migrations that later appeared in Egyptian records as the movements of the Sea Peoples. If drought weakened agricultural systems across the Mediterranean, displaced populations might have begun moving toward more fertile regions along the coast. This would explain why the Sea Peoples sometimes appear in Egyptian reliefs traveling with families, wagons, and possessions, rather than behaving purely like invading armies. They may have been refugees as well as warriors. At the same time, drought would have weakened the kingdoms they were encountering. Cities already struggling with food shortages would find it harder to support large armies. Governments dealing with famine might lose control of local populations. Trade networks that once transported surplus grain between regions could collapse under the strain. When multiple crises happen at once, environmental, political, economic, and military, civilizations can reach a tipping point. The Bronze Age world may have reached exactly that moment. Drought weakened agriculture. Trade failures weakened economies. Migrations increased pressure on already unstable regions. Invasions destroyed cities that might otherwise have recovered. Each crisis made the others worse. By the early 12th century BC, the ancient Mediterranean world was facing a perfect storm of disasters. And once the collapse began accelerating, it became almost impossible to stop. The interconnected network that had supported the Bronze Age for centuries was breaking apart. One kingdom after another would fall, and the world that had existed for generations would soon disappear. While drought, migration, invasion, and economic collapse were weakening the Bronze Age world, another destructive force may also have been moving through the eastern Mediterranean. Unlike famine, it gave no warning. Unlike political instability, it could not be negotiated. And unlike invading armies, it needed no ships, no roads, and no kings. It came from beneath the ground itself. Earthquakes. The eastern Mediterranean sits on one of the most unstable geological zones in the world. Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and the Aegean all lie near major fault systems where tectonic plates grind, shift, and release enormous pressure. Even today, this region experiences powerful earthquakes capable of leveling towns, fracturing roads, and shattering ports in a matter of seconds. But some researchers believe that during the centuries surrounding the Bronze Age collapse, the region may have experienced not just isolated earthquakes, but something far worse. A chain of major seismic events, a phenomenon sometimes described as an earthquake storm. An earthquake storm happens when a sequence of powerful earthquakes strikes connected fault systems over a relatively short historical period. Instead of one isolated disaster, one quake increases pressure on nearby faults, making further earthquakes more likely. The result can be decades of recurring destruction spreading from region to region. If something like this unfolded around the end of the Bronze Age, the consequences would have been devastating. Many of the civilizations of that era depended on massive stone architecture. Palaces, temples, fortification walls, storage complexes, and administrative buildings were all vulnerable to sudden ground movement. A single strong quake could crack foundations, collapse gates, destroy granaries, and leave entire cities exposed to later attack. And that is exactly what makes the theory so compelling. At several important Bronze Age sites, archaeologists have found destruction patterns that may be consistent with seismic activity. In some places, walls appear to have toppled in ways suggesting violent ground shaking. At others, large stones shifted out of alignment, stairways collapsed, and structures seem to have failed suddenly before later being consumed by fire. Sites such as Mycenaeans, Tiryns, Ugarit, and Hattusa have all been discussed in this context. Not every archaeologist agrees on the interpretation, and earthquake evidence is notoriously difficult to prove with certainty after thousands of years. Fire, warfare, neglect, and rebuilding can all complicate the picture, but the possibility remains difficult to dismiss. Because even if earthquakes did not destroy every city, they may have weakened many of them at exactly the worst possible time. Imagine a kingdom already suffering from failed harvests. Trade ships are no longer arriving on schedule. Bronze supplies are dwindling. Political tensions are rising. Coastal raids are increasing. Palace officials are trying to maintain order while local populations grow more desperate. Then, a major earthquake strikes. Walls crack. Storage jars shatter. Temples collapse. Administrative buildings become unsafe. Sections of fortifications fall away. Suddenly, a city that once looked secure is exposed. Even worse, recovery in the Bronze Age was not simple. Rebuilding monumental architecture required labor, timber, stone, food reserves, and centralized authority. A strong palace administration could organize that effort, but only if the kingdom was still politically stable and economically functional. During the final decades of the Bronze Age, many kingdoms were no longer stable enough to recover quickly. That is what makes earthquakes so important in this story. By themselves, earthquakes rarely erase entire civilizations forever. Ancient societies had survived them before. Cities could rebuild, walls could be repaired, temples could be reconstructed. But when earthquakes strike a world already weakened by drought, famine, migration, invasion, and trade disruption, they become something else. They become force multipliers. A damaged harbor means fewer ships can dock. A collapsed granary means less food can be stored. Broken roads and gates make military response slower. Panicked populations may flee rather than rebuild. Rival groups may attack while a city is still in ruins. What might once have been a recoverable disaster can suddenly become the beginning of total collapse. This is why many historians no longer search for one single cause behind the events around 1177 BC. The evidence points instead to a convergence of disasters. Drought reduced food production. Trade failures cut off essential materials. Migrations destabilized frontiers. Invasions destroyed cities. And earthquakes may have damaged the very infrastructure that held kingdoms together. Each crisis made the others worse. A city weakened by drought is less able to respond to invasion. A kingdom disrupted by trade collapse is less able to rebuild after an earthquake. A palace damaged by seismic shock is more vulnerable to rebellion, fire, or foreign attack. One disaster feeds the next, and once enough parts of the system begin failing at once, the entire network can unravel with terrifying speed. This is the core of the Bronze Age collapse. Not one event, not one enemy, not one bad harvest, but a world so interconnected and so stressed that repeated shocks pushed it beyond the point of recovery. And earthquakes, whether primary cause or secondary accelerator, may have played a crucial role in that process. Because a civilization does not need every city to fall at once in order to collapse. It only needs enough key centers to fail faster than the system can repair them. That may be exactly what happened in the Eastern Mediterranean. The palaces cracked. The walls fell. The ports failed. The granaries emptied. And as the earth itself seemed to turn against them, rulers across the Bronze Age world faced another terrifying reality. The danger was no longer coming only from outside. Inside many kingdoms, political order was beginning to break. Local elites fought for power. Subjects may have rebelled. Regional loyalties weakened. And when central authority began to collapse from within, even the strongest civilization could suddenly become fragile. Because in the end, civilizations rarely fall from one blow alone. They fall when every weakness is exposed at once. While drought, invasions, migration, and earthquakes were weakening the Bronze Age world from the outside, another danger was growing quietly within many kingdoms themselves: internal instability. History often remembers the destruction of civilizations as dramatic moments: cities burning, armies invading, walls collapsing. But in reality, civilizations frequently begin to fall apart long before the final disaster arrives. They weaken from within. The great palace systems of the late Bronze Age depended on centralized authority. Kings ruled through networks of administrators, scribes, tax collectors, and military officials who coordinated agriculture, trade, labor, and defense. These palace administrations were the engines that kept Bronze Age societies functioning. They organized the storage of grain. They distributed bronze weapons. They managed long-distance trade. They maintained armies and fortifications. As long as these systems worked, kingdoms could survive droughts, wars, or natural disasters. But when the palace systems themselves began to weaken, everything else became unstable. Archaeological evidence from several Bronze Age sites suggests that internal tensions may have been growing during the final decades before the collapse. In some regions, settlements appear to have been abandoned gradually rather than destroyed suddenly. This may indicate political or economic breakdown rather than purely military conquest. If central authorities could no longer maintain order, local communities might choose to leave vulnerable cities and return to smaller rural settlements where survival was easier. In other cases, evidence suggests that elite power structures were breaking apart. Palace complexes that once coordinated entire regional economies suddenly stopped functioning. Administrative records disappear.
Writing systems that had been used for centuries vanish almost overnight.
This is exactly what happened in Mycenaean Greece. The linear B writing system, used by palace administrators to record taxes, labor assignments, and trade goods, disappeared shortly after the collapse of the palace centers. For several centuries afterward, writing itself vanished from the Greek world. This is one of the most dramatic indicators of how complete the collapse may have been. When a civilization loses not only its political centers but also its systems of knowledge and record-keeping, rebuilding becomes extremely difficult. And this pattern was not limited to Greece. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the disappearance of administrative systems suggests that central governments were failing.
Without effective governments, societies lose the ability to coordinate large projects. Armies become harder to organize. Trade becomes unpredictable. Infrastructure begins to decay. Local elites may compete for power instead of cooperating to stabilize the kingdom. In such conditions, rebellions can become more likely. Populations suffering from food shortages, high taxes, or political instability may rise against their rulers. Once palace authority weakens, these uprisings can spread quickly. Some historians believe that internal revolts may have contributed to the destruction of certain Bronze Age cities. When central authority collapses, even small conflicts can escalate into major disasters. A palace burned during a rebellion might never be rebuilt if the kingdom lacks the resources to recover.
And once the administrative center disappears, the entire political system can unravel. This possibility highlights an important truth about the Bronze Age collapse. The end of these civilizations was probably not caused by a single invading force or a single environmental disaster. Instead, multiple pressures were acting simultaneously. Drought reduced harvests, trade networks broke down, migrations increased tensions between populations, earthquakes damaged infrastructure, and within many kingdoms, political authority was beginning to fracture. Each of these problems made the others worse. A government weakened by famine is less capable of defending its borders.
A city damaged by earthquake is more vulnerable to rebellion. A kingdom struggling with migration may lose control of distant territories. As these crises overlapped, the stability that had supported Bronze Age civilization began to disappear. The collapse spread from one region to another. Cities fell. Kingdoms vanished. Trade routes disappeared. And by the early 12th century BC, the world that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries was rapidly fading into history. What replaced it would be a very different world. One with fewer great kingdoms, smaller populations, and far less international connection. A world that historians now call the Early Iron Age. But before that new age could begin, the Bronze Age world would experience its final unraveling, and the consequences would echo across the Mediterranean for centuries. By the early 12th century BC, the Bronze Age world was no longer facing isolated disasters. It was facing a chain reaction. For centuries, the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean had depended on one another in ways their rulers may never have fully understood. Trade routes linked distant kingdoms by land and sea. Diplomacy connected royal courts across enormous distances. Merchant ships carried copper, tin, grain, oil, timber, ivory, textiles, and luxury goods between ports stretching from the Aegean to Egypt and from Cyprus to the Levant. This network created wealth, stability, and power. But it also created fragility. The more interconnected the Bronze Age world became, the more dangerous failure in one part of the system became for all the others. A city could no longer collapse quietly. A broken trade route could no longer remain a local problem. The fall of one kingdom could send pressure rippling across the entire Mediterranean. This is exactly what appears to have happened. At first, the disruptions may have seemed manageable. A shipment arrived late. A local rebellion broke out. A coastal town was raided. A neighboring kingdom entered a period of instability. In another era, the system might have absorbed such shocks. But by the late 13th century BC, the pressures were arriving too quickly and from too many directions. A drought reduced harvests. Trade became less reliable. Migration increased along vulnerable frontiers. Some cities suffered violent attacks. Others may have been weakened by earthquakes or internal unrest. Each crisis did not simply exist beside the others. Each crisis made the others worse. This is the key to understanding the collapse. The Bronze Age world did not fall because of one enemy or one catastrophe. It fell because many parts of an interconnected system began to fail at once, and every new failure weakened the whole structure further. The destruction of a single port could interrupt trade across an entire region. The fall of one major kingdom could expose smaller allies that had depended on its military protection. The abandonment of one palace center could shatter tax collection, food storage, and local security in the territory around it. And once enough of those failures began to overlap, the system entered a dangerous cycle. Every loss created new vulnerabilities. Every vulnerability invited further losses. One of the clearest examples of this domino effect can be seen in the collapse of the Hittite Empire. For centuries, the Hittites had been one of the central powers of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their empire linked Anatolia, northern Syria, and key inland routes that connected the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia and beyond. They were not simply a military power. They were a stabilizing force within a much larger world system. When the Hittite Empire began to fail, the consequences reached far beyond its own borders. Regions that had once been protected by Hittite authority became unstable. Vassal states lost their political center. Trade routes that passed through Hittite territory became uncertain or dangerous. Rival groups moved into the vacuum. The collapse of this one empire removed an entire layer of order from the ancient world. The same pattern can be seen in the fall of Mycenaean Greece. The Mycenaean palace centers were not isolated hilltop fortresses disconnected from the wider Mediterranean. They were deeply involved in trade, warfare, and regional administration. Their ships helped move goods across the Aegean. Their elites participated in a world of diplomacy and exchange that connected them to Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Levant. When these palace systems collapsed, another major support beam of the Bronze Age world gave way. Ports that had once linked Greece to the Eastern Mediterranean became quieter. Administrative systems that organized production and exchange disappeared. Craft specialization declined. Long-distance trade weakened further. This mattered because the Bronze Age world depended on movement. Metals had to move. Food had to move. Messages had to move. Armies had to move. Once those flows became unstable, the system as a whole began to lose coherence. Even cities that were not immediately destroyed would have felt the strain. A kingdom might still have its walls, its palace, and its king. But if trade partners had vanished, bronze supplies had shrunk, neighboring populations were migrating, and old allies could no longer send aid, then that kingdom was already living inside collapse, whether it knew it or not. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so modern in its logic. Highly connected systems can appear incredibly strong right up until the moment they begin to fail. For generations, the Mediterranean network had expanded because interdependence brought prosperity. But once crisis struck, that same interdependence became a weakness. The stronger the connections had been, the faster disruption could spread through them. A shortage in one region became a military problem in another. A destroyed city in one kingdom became an economic crisis for its trading partners. The fall of one political center became the beginning of instability everywhere around it. By the time rulers recognized the scale of what was happening, it may already have been too late. The dominoes were already falling. One by one, the pillars of the old order disappeared. Great cities burned. Palace administrations ended. Trade routes broke apart. Empires that had once seemed permanent vanished from history. Communities that survived often retreated into smaller, poorer, more local ways of life. And that may be the most unsettling part of the story. The
The Bronze Age world did not simply suffer a few dramatic defeats. It lost the ability to hold itself together.
Once that happened, collapse was no longer a single event. It became a process moving across the Mediterranean from kingdom to kingdom, coast to coast, generation to generation. And by the time it ended, the world that had once linked Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus, and Egypt into one great international system had been transformed beyond recognition. The empires were gone. The palace kingdoms were gone. The old balance of power was gone. What remained was a fractured world entering a new and uncertain age, an age that would be poorer, darker, and far less connected than the one that had come before. When the Bronze Age system finally broke apart, the change was not subtle. Within only a few generations, the political and economic world that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries disappeared. The palace kingdoms that once organized trade, warfare, and diplomacy across the region were gone. In their place was something very different. A fractured landscape of smaller communities struggling to survive in a world that had suddenly become far less connected. For many regions, the collapse meant a dramatic decline in population. Archaeological surveys show that numerous settlements were abandoned during the decades following the destruction of the major palace centers. Some cities were burned and never rebuilt. Others slowly shrank as people left urban areas and moved into smaller villages. Large political systems that once coordinated resources across entire regions vanished. Without strong central governments, societies lost the ability to maintain many of the institutions that had defined the Bronze Age world. Palace bureaucracies disappeared. Long-distance trade networks broke down. Monumental construction projects stopped almost completely. In some places, even writing vanished. This is particularly visible in Greece. Before the collapse, Mycenaean palace administrators used the Linear B writing system to record taxes, labor assignments, agricultural production, and trade goods. Clay tablets filled palace archives with detailed information about the economic life of entire regions. But after the destruction of the palace centers, that writing system disappeared. For centuries afterward, the Greek world left almost no written records at all. This period is often called the Greek Dark Age. It was not necessarily dark because people vanished or civilization ended entirely. Communities continued to exist, farmland, raise animals, and maintain local traditions. But the complexity of the earlier Bronze Age societies had been lost. Trade became more limited. Political authority became more local. Technology and craftsmanship sometimes declined. The same pattern can be seen in other parts of the Mediterranean. Cities that once served as international trading hubs no longer played the same role. Diplomatic correspondence between distant kings disappeared. The complex web of alliances and rivalries that had connected great kingdoms across the region simply faded from the historical record. In effect, the Mediterranean world became smaller. Connections that once linked distant civilizations were broken. For people living through these changes, the experience must have been deeply disorienting. A generation earlier, merchants might have traveled between powerful kingdoms whose rulers exchanged gifts, letters, and diplomatic marriages. Ships carried metals and luxury goods across the sea, and palace economies organized production on a massive scale. Then, within a relatively short period of time, that world vanished. The old trade routes were no longer reliable. Many royal courts had disappeared. Cities that once dominated their regions lay in ruins. For centuries afterward, the memory of that earlier international world would survive only in fragments. Legends of powerful kings, stories of lost cities, ruins of massive fortifications and temples whose builders were long forgotten. In later Greek tradition, this fading memory may have been preserved in epic stories such as the Trojan War, where powerful kingdoms clash before disappearing into myth. Whether those stories reflect real historical events or later cultural memory remains debated. But they may represent echoes of a time when the Mediterranean world was far more interconnected and powerful than it would be for centuries afterward.
Eventually, new civilizations would rise.
The Iron Age would bring new technologies, new political systems, and new cultural developments.
Greece would slowly recover and eventually give birth to the classical civilization that shaped much of Western history. Phoenician traders would expand maritime networks across the Mediterranean. But these changes would take centuries. In the meantime, the collapse of the Bronze Age left a deep historical scar. For a long time, historians struggled to understand how so many powerful civilizations could disappear within such a short period. The fall of cities, the disappearance of empires, and the breakdown of international trade seemed almost too sudden to explain. Yet the evidence suggests that the collapse was not caused by a single dramatic event.
It was the result of multiple pressures converging at the same time: environmental stress, migration, invasion, economic failure, political instability. And once those pressures pushed the interconnected Bronze Age system beyond its limits, the entire structure began to unravel. The collapse of around 1177 BC was not simply the fall of a few kingdoms. It was the end of an entire world. By the early Iron Age, the Mediterranean world looked dramatically different from the one that had existed only a few generations earlier. The vast international network that once connected powerful kingdoms had vanished. Trade routes that had carried metals, grain, and luxury goods across thousands of kilometers were broken or reduced to small local exchanges. Cities that had once been vibrant centers of administration and commerce were now silent ruins. Entire political systems had disappeared. For centuries during the Bronze Age, powerful palace kingdoms had organized the economic life of entire regions. Administrators recorded harvests, collected taxes, stored grain, and coordinated trade. Kings communicated with distant rulers through diplomatic letters written on clay tablets. Armies protected trade routes and enforced political authority. But after the collapse, many of these systems simply ceased to exist. Without strong central governments, societies became far more localized. Instead of vast territories ruled by powerful monarchs, the landscape became fragmented into smaller communities, villages, and regional centers. In many places, populations appear to have declined significantly. Archaeological surveys across Greece and parts of Anatolia show that numerous settlements were abandoned during the decades following the collapse of the palace systems. Some regions that had once supported dense populations became sparsely inhabited. Cities that had once dominated their surrounding landscapes shrank dramatically or disappeared entirely. This transformation was not necessarily caused by a single disaster. Instead, it appears to have been the long-term consequence of the systemic collapse that had spread through the Mediterranean world. When trade networks broke down, many communities lost access to essential resources. When palace administrations disappeared, the complex systems that organized agriculture and storage also vanished. Without those institutions, maintaining large urban populations became extremely difficult. Smaller communities proved easier to sustain. People could rely on local farming rather than distant trade networks. Villages could survive without the elaborate bureaucracies that palace economies required. Over time, many societies reorganized themselves around these simpler structures, but something important was lost in the process. Complex knowledge systems that had developed during the Bronze Age faded from memory. One of the most striking examples of this loss is the disappearance of writing in several regions. In Mycenaean Greece, palace administrators had used the linear B script to record detailed economic information. Thousands of clay tablets documented taxes, livestock counts, labor assignments, and shipments of goods. When the palace centers collapsed, that writing system vanished with them. For several centuries afterward, the Greek world produced almost no written records at all. This does not mean that people became less intelligent or less capable, but it does mean that the administrative structures that required writing had disappeared. Without palace bureaucracies to manage large economies, there was no longer a need for scribes to record complex economic data. Knowledge that had once been carefully recorded was now transmitted through oral traditions. Stories replaced archives. Legends replaced official records. And over time,
the memory of the Bronze Age world itself began to fade. The great empires were gone. The palace kingdoms were gone. The international diplomacy that had once linked distant rulers disappeared. For the people living centuries later, the ruins of Bronze Age cities must have appeared mysterious and ancient. Massive stone walls, abandoned palaces, and crumbling temples stood as silent reminders of a world that had existed long before their own time. In many cases, later generations may not have fully understood who built these structures or why they had been abandoned. The collapse had been so complete that the historical memory of the earlier world was largely lost. This is one of the reasons the Bronze Age collapse remains such a fascinating moment in human history. Within only a few generations, an interconnected international system that had taken centuries to build disappeared almost entirely. And when the world finally began to recover, it would do so in a very different way. A new age was beginning, an age defined not by bronze, but by iron. For a time, the Mediterranean world seemed quieter after the collapse. The great palace kingdoms were gone. The vast international trade networks had been broken. The powerful empires that once shaped the political order of the region had vanished. But history rarely remains empty for long. Slowly, over the centuries that followed the Bronze Age collapse, new societies began to emerge from the ruins of the old world. These societies looked very different from the palace civilizations that had come before them. Instead of massive centralized kingdoms ruled by powerful monarchs, many regions now consisted of smaller political communities. Authority became more local. Power shifted toward regional leaders, tribal structures, and emerging city-states. This transformation was gradual. For several generations after the collapse, populations remained smaller and economies remained simpler than they had been during the height of the Bronze Age. Many of the old trade routes were still unreliable. Cities that had once served as major international ports were only beginning to recover. But new developments were slowly reshaping the Mediterranean world. One of the most important changes was the growing use of iron. During the Bronze Age, bronze had been the dominant metal for weapons and tools. But producing bronze required two specific resources, copper and tin, that were often found in different regions. This meant that bronze production depended heavily on long-distance trade networks. When those networks collapsed, bronze became more difficult to obtain. Iron offered an alternative. Although iron had been known for centuries, it had rarely been used on a large scale during the Bronze Age because it was harder to work with using earlier technologies. But after the collapse of the bronze trade networks, societies began experimenting more seriously with iron tools and weapons. Iron had one important advantage. Unlike tin, iron ore was relatively common in many parts of the Mediterranean world. This meant that communities could produce their own metal tools without relying on fragile international trade routes. Over time, improvements in metalworking techniques made iron increasingly practical. The spread of iron technology would eventually transform warfare, agriculture, and craftsmanship across the ancient world. But technological change was only one part of the transformation. New maritime traders also began to reshape the Mediterranean economy. Among the most important of these were the Phoenicians, skilled seafarers from the Levantine coast. In the centuries following the collapse, Phoenician merchants began establishing trading settlements across the Mediterranean. Their ships traveled westward, connecting distant regions that had once been cut off after the Bronze Age collapse. Phoenician traders carried metals, textiles, glass, and luxury goods between ports in the eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and eventually even the western Mediterranean. Through these networks, long-distance trade slowly began to recover. Other societies were also transforming. In Greece, small communities that had survived the collapse gradually reorganized into new political forms that would eventually become the Greek city-states, or polis. Over time, places such as Athens, Sparta, and Corinth would grow into powerful centers of culture, politics, and warfare. But these developments would take centuries. For a long time after the collapse, the Mediterranean world remained a landscape of recovery. Cities were rebuilt slowly. Trade networks were reconstructed piece by piece. New political systems emerged from the fragments of the old order. In many ways, the Iron Age world that eventually emerged was shaped directly by the lessons of the Bronze Age collapse. Societies became less dependent on fragile, long-distance trade networks.
Political power became more decentralized in many regions. Communities developed new technologies and new systems of organization that were better adapted to the realities of a more uncertain world. But the memory of the earlier age was never completely erased. Ruins of massive Bronze Age cities still stood across the Mediterranean landscape. Collapsed palaces, ancient fortification walls, abandoned temples. These structures reminded later generations that another world had once existed, a world of powerful kings, international diplomacy, and vast trade networks linking distant civilizations. That world had disappeared around the end of the 12th century BC, and the question of why it collapsed so suddenly would remain one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Because even today, historians are still trying to fully understand what really happened around 1177 BC, and whether something similar could ever happen again. More than 3,000 years have passed since the collapse of the Bronze Age world. Cities have been rebuilt, new civilizations have risen and fallen, entire empires have appeared and disappeared across the Mediterranean and the Near East. Yet the events surrounding the collapse of around 1177 BC continue to puzzle historians. The archaeological record clearly shows that something extraordinary happened during that period. Across vast regions of the eastern Mediterranean, cities were destroyed, kingdoms disappeared, and long-standing trade networks broke apart. What remains uncertain is exactly why it happened. Early historians once believed the answer was simple. They argued that the Bronze Age collapse was caused primarily by invading enemies, especially the mysterious sea peoples described in Egyptian inscriptions. According to this interpretation, migrating warrior groups swept across the Mediterranean, destroying the great kingdoms of the age. But as more archaeological evidence emerged, that explanation began to seem incomplete. Some cities that were destroyed show signs of violent attack, but others appear to have declined gradually. In some places, evidence suggests economic disruption rather than military conquest. In others, environmental stress may have played a larger role. This led historians to reconsider the problem. Instead of searching for one single cause, many researchers now believe the collapse resulted from multiple overlapping crises. Each crisis weakened the system in different ways. Environmental change may have reduced agricultural productivity across several regions. Evidence from pollen studies, lake sediments, and other environmental data suggests that drought conditions may have persisted for decades during the late Bronze Age. If harvests repeatedly failed, populations would suffer from food shortages. Food shortages can lead to migration. Migration can lead to conflict. Conflict can destabilize entire regions. At the same time, the international trade networks that supported Bronze Age economies were already fragile. When cities were destroyed or trade routes became unsafe, the flow of essential materials such as copper and tin could be disrupted. Without these resources, bronze production declined. Without bronze weapons and tools, kingdoms struggled to maintain military strength and agricultural productivity. Political instability added further pressure. Palace administrations that once coordinated regional economies may have faced growing internal tensions. Local elites could challenge royal authority. Rebellions might break out in territories already weakened by famine or economic hardship. Natural disasters may also have contributed. Some archaeologists believe that a series of earthquakes, sometimes described as an earthquake storm, may have struck parts of the eastern Mediterranean during this period. While earthquakes alone rarely destroy entire civilizations, they can cause enormous damage to cities and infrastructure. In a world already weakened by drought, migration, and economic instability, even a few powerful earthquakes could push fragile societies past the point of recovery. When historians look at the evidence today, they increasingly see the Bronze Age collapse as a perfect storm. Not one disaster,
but many disasters happening at the same time. Each crisis reinforced the others. Drought weakened food production. Economic disruption weakened trade networks. Migration created new conflicts. Invasions destroyed vulnerable cities. Earthquakes damaged infrastructure. Internal rebellions undermined political authority. Together, these pressures overwhelmed the complex system that had supported the Bronze Age world. Once enough parts of that system failed, collapse spread quickly from one region to another, and within only a few generations, the international network that had linked the great civilizations of the Mediterranean disappeared. But even after decades of research, many questions remain unanswered. Historians still debate how these crises began. They still debate which factor played the most important role, and they still debate how quickly the collapse actually occurred. What is clear is that the Bronze Age world was far more interconnected than earlier generations of historians once believed, and that interconnection may have been both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. The collapse of the Bronze Age world around 1177 BC is more than a historical mystery. It is also a warning. For centuries, historians studied the fall of ancient civilizations as isolated events. Empires rose and fell, cities were conquered, and societies disappeared. Each collapse seemed tied to a specific cause, an invading army, a weak ruler, or a sudden disaster. But the story of the Bronze Age collapse challenges that way of thinking. It shows how an entire system of civilizations can fail together. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean was one of the earliest examples of a highly interconnected international world. Trade routes linked distant regions. Diplomacy connected royal courts across thousands of kilometers. Economies depended on materials and resources that often came from far away. In many ways, it was an early version of globalization. Copper mined in Cyprus traveled to workshops in Greece and Anatolia. Tin moved through long and fragile trade networks that stretched across multiple regions. Luxury goods, grain, textiles, and precious materials moved constantly between powerful kingdoms. Merchants sailed across the Mediterranean. Kings exchanged diplomatic letters and gifts. Armies protected the flow of resources that kept the system functioning. For generations, this network created prosperity, but it also created vulnerability. When societies become deeply interconnected, disruptions in one region can quickly affect many others. If trade routes collapse, entire economies can weaken. If environmental changes reduce agricultural production, populations may migrate in search of food. If migrations bring conflict into already unstable regions, political systems may collapse. And when several of these pressures occur at the same time, the entire structure can unravel. This is what appears to have happened at the end of the Bronze Age. Drought reduced harvests. Trade networks weakened. Migration increased. Cities were attacked. Earthquakes damaged infrastructure. Internal rebellions undermined political authority. Each crisis intensified the others. Eventually, the system reached a tipping point. Once that point was crossed, collapse spread rapidly from kingdom to kingdom. The fall of one civilization destabilized its neighbors. The destruction of one port disrupted trade for many regions. The disappearance of one major power left entire territories exposed. Within only a few generations, the international order that had taken centuries to build was gone. This is why the Bronze Age collapse remains so important to historians today. It demonstrates how complex societies can become fragile when they depend on interconnected systems that must all function simultaneously. And it shows how quickly those systems can fail when enough pressure is applied. The ancient Mediterranean world did not collapse because people suddenly forgot how to build cities or grow crops. It collapsed because the systems that connected those societies stopped working. When trade stopped, resources disappeared. When resources disappeared, political power weakened. When political power weakened, violence spread. And once that cycle began, recovery became increasingly difficult. The lessons of that ancient collapse are not limited to the distant past. Modern civilization is also deeply interconnected. Global trade networks link continents. Economic systems depend on resources that come from many different regions. Communication technologies connect societies across the entire planet. These connections create extraordinary prosperity, but they also create complex dependencies. Just as in the Bronze Age world, disruptions in one part of the system can spread rapidly across the whole network. Understanding how ancient civilizations faced and failed to survive such pressures may help us better understand the vulnerabilities of complex societies today. Because the story of 1177 BC is not simply about the past. It is about how systems work and how they break. Looking back across more than 3,000 years of history, the collapse of the Bronze Age world still feels almost impossible to comprehend. Powerful civilizations that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries disappeared within the span of only a few generations. Cities that once controlled trade across vast regions were destroyed or abandoned. Empires that had rivaled each other in diplomacy and warfare simply vanished from the historical record. To later civilizations, the ruins of that lost world must have seemed mysterious. Massive stone fortifications still stood across the landscape. Abandoned palaces remained on hilltops where kings had once ruled. Temples and monumental gates continued to tower over silent cities whose populations had long since disappeared. But the systems that had created those structures were gone. The international network that once connected the great civilizations of the Mediterranean had collapsed. For centuries during the late Bronze Age, powerful kingdoms had formed an interconnected world. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, the wealthy cities of the Levant, and the trading centers of Cyprus were all tied together through diplomacy, commerce, and shared dependence on trade. Kings exchanged letters and gifts across thousands of kilometers. Merchant ships carried metals, grain, textiles, and luxury goods between distant ports. Armies protected trade routes, and political alliances maintained fragile balances of power between rival states. It was one of the earliest international systems in human history, and for generations, it worked. But by the end of the 13th century BC, the stability of that world began to weaken. Archaeological evidence shows that multiple regions experienced growing stress. Harvests may have declined in some areas as climate conditions changed. Trade networks became less reliable as instability spread across the Mediterranean. Migration increased as populations moved in search of food and security. Some cities suffered violent destruction. Others appear to have declined gradually as economic systems broke down. The Hittite Empire disappeared. The Mycenaean palace systems collapsed. Cities across the Levant were burned or abandoned. Trade routes that had connected the great powers for centuries suddenly failed. Within only a few decades, the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean was transformed. This is why historians often describe the events around 1177 BC as one of the most dramatic turning points in ancient history. It marked the end of a world. But the most fascinating aspect of the Bronze Age collapse is that it was not caused by a single disaster. There was no single enemy responsible for the destruction of every kingdom. There was no single earthquake that destroyed every city. There was no single drought that affected every region in exactly the same way. Instead, the evidence points to something far more complex. A convergence of crises. Environmental stress may have reduced agricultural production across several regions. Drought conditions could have weakened societies that depended heavily on stable harvests. Trade networks began to fail as cities were destroyed and political alliances collapsed. Migration increased as displaced populations searched for new lands. The mysterious sea peoples appear in Egyptian records, attacking coastal regions and contributing to the instability. Earthquakes may have damaged cities and infrastructure in several areas. Internal rebellions may have weakened palace administrations that once coordinated entire regional economies. Individually, each of these pressures might have been survivable. Civilizations had endured drought before. They had survived invasions before. They had rebuilt after earthquakes and political crises. But what made the end of the Bronze Age different was the timing. All of these pressures appear to have occurred within the same historical window. The system was struck again and again before it could recover. Every new disruption weakened the network further. Every failure made the next one more destructive. Eventually, the interconnected world of the Bronze Age reached a point where recovery was no longer possible. Once that threshold was crossed, collapse spread rapidly. Cities burned, empires disappeared, trade routes vanished, administrative systems failed, and the complex international order that had taken centuries to build unraveled within only a few generations. For the people who lived through these events, the experience must have been terrifying. A generation earlier, the Mediterranean world had been filled with powerful kingdoms, thriving cities, and flourishing trade networks. Within a few decades, that world was gone. The Bronze Age had ended, and humanity had entered a far more uncertain era. But the story of 1177 BC is not simply about destruction. It is also about transformation. Because from the ruins of that collapsing world, new societies would eventually rise. New technologies would spread. New political systems would emerge. And over time, the Mediterranean would slowly rebuild itself into something entirely different from the world that had been lost. But before that new age could begin, the collapse had to finish its course, and the ancient world would never be the same again. When historians speak about the collapse of the Bronze Age, they often focus on destruction. Burned cities, abandoned palaces, empires disappearing from the historical record. But the deeper story is not only about how a world ended, it is about how fragile even the most powerful systems can become. For centuries before the collapse, the Mediterranean world had grown increasingly complex. Kingdoms traded with distant lands. Political alliances connected rulers across enormous distances. Economies depended on materials that arrived from faraway regions. The system created stability and prosperity, but complexity also created vulnerability. The more interconnected the Bronze Age world became, the more it depended on everything continuing to function perfectly. Trade had to keep flowing, harvests had to remain stable, political alliances had to hold, cities had to remain secure. When those conditions existed, the system worked remarkably well. But once the disruptions began, the system had very little ability to absorb them. A drought could weaken agriculture. A migration could destabilize borders. An invasion could destroy a key trading port. An earthquake could damage a capital city. Each crisis alone might have been survivable. Together, they became catastrophic. The collapse of the Bronze Age reminds us that civilizations rarely disappear because of a single event. They disappear when multiple pressures combine and push a complex system beyond its limits. And once that tipping point is reached, collapse can spread with astonishing speed. That is what makes the events around 1177 BC so remarkable. Within only a few generations, the interconnected network that linked the great civilizations of the Mediterranean fell apart. The palace kingdoms of Greece disappeared. The Hittite Empire vanished. Cities across the Levant were destroyed. Trade routes that had carried metals, grain, and luxury goods across thousands of kilometers broke down. An international system that had taken centuries to build was gone. Yet human societies did not disappear. Communities survived. Farmers continued to work the land. Small settlements endured even as great cities fell. Over time, new political systems slowly began to emerge from the ruins. Iron replaced bronze as the dominant metal for tools and weapons. New trade networks developed. New cultures and civilizations began to rise. Centuries later, the Mediterranean world would once again become a center of powerful states and vibrant exchange. But the new world would not look the same as the old one. The collapse of the Bronze Age permanently reshaped the course of history. It cleared the stage for the rise of new civilizations. The Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Assyrians, and eventually many others who would define the ancient world that followed. In many ways, the end of the Bronze Age was also the beginning of something new, but the mystery remains.
Even today, historians continue to debate exactly how and why this collapse unfolded. Was drought the initial trigger? Did migration destabilize entire regions? Did earthquakes accelerate destruction? Did internal rebellions weaken palace governments before the final disasters arrived? Or was it the combination of all these forces at once? The truth may be that the Bronze Age collapse was not caused by a single event at all. It was the failure of a complex system, a system that had grown powerful, wealthy, and interconnected, but also increasingly fragile. And when that fragile system finally broke, it changed the course of human history. Around 1177 BC, an entire world ended, not with one final battle, but with a cascade of crises that no civilization could stop. And from the ruins of that world, the next chapter of human history began.